Well, hello, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives. And tonight we're going to have a special show. I'm very happy to bring to the show Nick, who goes by Nick from Twitter, because he chooses to remain anonymous. And the reason for that, I guess, will be apparent when we get into the details of what we're going to talk about tonight. But first, I'm very grateful to you, Nick, for taking the time out on a Friday evening to teach me a little bit about your work and what you've been able to put together research-wise. So thanks again and welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me, John. It's a pleasure to join you and your listeners, and I'm always happy to help share this information. It's a body of research that goes back at this point close to 40 years, really, as far as the whistleblowers on the topic. And the science that preceded what we're going to be talking about runs all the way back to the 1950s for the most part. So this will be quite a time machine. I've heard some of your guests recently, and I know that you get into some fine detail and name names. So I hope everyone enjoys our discussion tonight.
Well, thank you so much. Well, let me ask you to start by just familiarizing us a little bit with your path that got you to do all this research.
Absolutely. The title that I have adopted is independent investigator. The specifics of the work that I focus on really are medical anthropology, which means the specific history of a medical event. And in this case, we're talking about an intersection of biowarfare history from the US defense and intelligence communities and how that intersected with a couple of different areas of public health. So that's really my title in this work. That's the voice that I bring to this discussion. My background with academic science in the 1990s, I had an experience with a large university on the west coast of the US, worked in, we'll say, epidemiology and virology. That's as specific as I care to get. And I learned pretty quickly about the barriers and the politics of doing academic research and having to stick with a narrative or stick with the most popular view. And that didn't set well with me. So my bread and butter comes from a different industry now, but since that time, I've been reading and studying and confirming the work of a small circle of whistleblowers about the laboratory origin of HIV, AIDS. And so I would say, really, this has been a passion project, and I've engaged scientists, researchers, activists, people whose lives are affected by HIV/AIDS, either themselves, their own health, or their loved ones. So, with that being said, we're going to be speaking in pretty stark and unapologetic terms this evening about medical and military and intelligence activities that look to have preceded the emergence of HIV in human populations. So I just want listeners to be warned. This is going to be kind of a grim discussion tonight, but I'm going to hopefully set you on the path to doubt everything that I'm saying and to discount all of it and go and dig up these details for yourself and confirm them for yourself if you see fit to do so. That would be my hope, is that I really ruffle your feathers and point you in the direction of these early whistleblowers who are published, lettered scientists, and you can see for yourself where the evidence came from.
Where does the idea of biological warfare start for you? Is it you have 1955 on your timeline, but clearly the ideas were there before that. Where does this whole idea begin in terms of your own experience and your research?
It's kind of elastic, John. I really, from a just a baseline of thinking about history and human beings and their behavior, my mind wants to tell me, this is a World War I origin point. But I say it's elastic because as I continue to look at content like ethnobotany, etc., there's evidence and records of people dipping poisoned arrow tips, centuries and centuries ago. It goes back a
Sure.
long time. So poisoning, biowarfare, throwing, say catapulting a plague infested body over the wall of your enemy's city to infest them with plague. It goes back as long as people have been aware of the infectious nature of disease. As to the specifics of this story, it really is rooted in activities from World War II forward.
Hmm. Okay, well, where should we begin?
Well, we're going to start by talking about we'll start at the beginning and work our way forward. Um, as to how did I wrap my head around this? How did I immerse myself in this? I came across a book written by a dermatologist named Dr. Alan Cantwell, and it was titled quite dramatically AIDS and the Doctors of Death. And the cover looks as dramatic as the title sounds. I found this in the late 1980s and was a young man who was quite frankly overwhelmed and in a state of shock about what was happening with HIV/AIDS, the political landscape, the George Bush Sr. Administration, and the early consternation with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Those were all of the headlines when I encountered this outlandish claim by Dr. Cantwell, and that was that as the result of, we'll say, sloppy or irresponsible science in the 1950s, it became clear that a number of infectious pathogens could emerge from the use of primate tissue and primates themselves in the production of human medicines. I don't know how much the audience is aware, but for quite some time during the last century, animals were used interchangeably, meaning their tissues, their blood, and living animals, complete whole animals, were used in the production of a number of human medical products. I'm talking about vaccines. And in doing so, they realized, hey, we've got a whole shelf of optional pathogens. They called them candidate viruses. That they were interested in because if they could be administered to, say, a South American president, it would appear to the rest of the world that they had suddenly, over a period of time, they would acquire cancer or leukemia and die in a very natural way. What the world wouldn't have known is that they had been exposed to one of these slow, what are called lentiviruses, or just long, they take a long, slow burn in the body before causing a serious disease. That sense of awareness that arose out of working with primates in medicine and discovering a number of patients presenting serious and deadly disease after receiving a primate based vaccine or some other procedure like that led pretty quickly in the early 60s to the formation of a group that became known as the Special Virus Cancer Program. Now, this described a great number of universities and private institutions and non governmental agencies that took part in something that had a storefront. Now, the storefront was we're in a battle against cancer. But what was happening in the back, the back front, business up front, party in the back, what was occurring on the back porch was this ongoing fascination and exploration of primate and other animal viruses that they determined could be crossed over into people and then could be made more pathogenic. And some of you might be saying, well, that sounds quite similar to what we understand today as gain of function biowarfare development. It is. At the time, they called it recombinant DNA technology. But as they started into this dangerous path, very quickly, these little projects in the Special Virus Cancer Program came to cross pollinate and intersect other areas of public health. One of them was the fight against hepatitis B. Now, the Willowbrook School in New York, for those of you that are medical historians, is a pretty major milestone in dealing with the ethics or the topic of bioethics in the use of human beings for medical procedures and experiments. And what we're discussing specifically is that in the early 50s, the Willowbrook School had a very difficult time with endemic hepatitis B contagion amongst the students or the wards of the state. These were children for the most part, and the staff. They couldn't get rid of it. They kept passing it back and forth. And this led to an intersection with primatology, going back to what I was talking about originally, using primates, particularly chimpanzees, and their constituent subunits in research and in making hepatitis vaccines and studying the ways that hepatitis worked and how they might fight it. So that's where hepatitis and eventually HIV seem to have had an early joining. Let me just stop there and check for questions.
Yeah, thanks. Where did the idea that we could use primates to develop vaccines and then inject that primate juice into humans? I mean, it sounds crazy, and yet we've been doing it for 100 years. So, was there ever any controversy about it? Did anybody say, "Hey, wait a minute, you can't do that," or did the medical specialists of the day just say, "Oh, okay, that's what we do now. We use this
Well,
chimpanzee juice to try to cure disease." Where does this come from?
well, this is where it bifurcates, and I just can't make excuses for medical research and for, agencies like the FDA, the AMA, the CDC, the NIH, etc. I won't apologize for what appears to be monstrous oversight or lack of oversight as to those kinds of risks, specifically because these risks were called out and they were squelched. Let's talk about a couple of examples really quick. Most people have heard of pneumonia. You hear about your grandma getting pneumonia, and it's a big risk to the elderly. Well, what most folks have no idea about is that pneumonia, or as it's more commonly, and pneumonia can come from different medical conditions in the lungs, but quite commonly, infectious pneumonia arises from a pathogen that is now titled RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. Originally, it was titled CCA, chimpanzee coryza agent. And the reason they knew that it was a chimpanzee virus is because they made some experimental vaccines, gave them to children, and the children developed dangerous bacterial pneumonia. So that's one example of how did a primate pathogen get into people right through that pathway by assuming that simple processes which are called inactivation, meaning you take let's talk about how a chimpanzee might be used to do that. They would stun the animal chemically so that they could excise the kidneys while they're still living. They don't want that toxicity to affect the tissue. So they keep the animal alive and do a living vivisection of the kidneys. The kidneys are then pulverized and pureed and turned into what's called a cellular substrate. Think of it like dirt that you're going to put a seed in to grow a plant. That's where the risk begins. They wash it chemically. They call that inactivation. There's formalin inactivation. There's been different eras of chemical treatments that they think make it safe and effective as a substrate upon which to grow various types of vaccine products. And it was in that practice that they soon realized, something's wrong here. Some of our patients are developing leukemia. Some of our patients are developing pneumonia. Some of our patients are developing other strange and exotic conditions that don't present normally in their demographic. From that point, once they realized, and people like Dr. Bernice Eddy came forward and blew the whistle and said, hey, I found this virus in your commercial vaccine stocks, vaccine vials that were on the shelf in a doctor's office ready to go into someone's arm. And we put them into animals. And within weeks, the animals presented tumors. She blew the whistle. She went up and down. She presented to Congress. Finally, she presented at Cold Spring Harbor to a large group of scientists. And these were folks who were in charge of the NIH, the DoD, the AMA, there were all kinds. There were pharma leadership, there was State Department folks there. She brought all of her information, excuse me, and was basically swept under the rug. She was defunded. And the story of SV40, simian virus 40, which would mean it was just the 40th contaminating virus found in primate materials, that story was subsumed by a Merck employee, a new virologist named Dr. Maurice Hilleman, who kind of became the father of hepatitis B vaccines and hepatitis experiments and research. But that's how it came to be. They made assumptions with their science. They discovered that there was contamination events, and instead of instead of no longer using primates, they spun off biowarfare projects so that they could study these fascinating new germs. As to the ethics of how and why, there's a whole lot to unpack there, and I don't think we're going to get to all of that, in the space of an hour. But it does go back to specific motivations. I don't think that it was just apathy or sloppy science that persisted past these red flag events. I think at that point, it was a very clear intent to pursue these pathogens, to find more of them in nature, and to bring them over into the human biology so that they could be examined as biowarfare.
However, it didn't start as biowarfare. It started as you say, as an effort to cure disease. And the whole idea of using that infected population at Willowbrook was to learn how to cure what they considered to be a disease that they could possibly develop a vaccine for. And so up to that point, we're not seeing anything sinister going on here. Is that the way you interpret it?
Unfortunately, if you will roll the clock back a few more years to events that transpired at the end of World War II,
Hmm.
there's clear evidence that a great number of the paperclip scientists acquired by the State Department and the CIA and brought over to the US, a large percentage of the biological scientists aggregated at Merck. They decided they wanted to work together at the same company, and a large number of them arrived at Merck in the early 1950s. And with them, they brought skills, experience, and investigative, we'll say, directions from the war. And there's clear, specific evidence in their content and materials that they were interested in infectious pathogens, particularly the ability to infect a population through an inoculant. Though those are the words used by Hitler's doctors. So it's got, I say this is a big rabbit hole, and there are some components, that being one of them, where we go into a domain of very little concrete, whistleblower documents that we can get our hands on because it's all state secrets. I mean, who's got that, and who can trot that kind of stuff out to the public? You can't. But we can learn from declassified content, particularly the CIA archives, and uh, literally papers published in the peer review literature by the paperclip scientists themselves as they continue this exploration of infectious disease and how it can be weaponized. It doesn't appear to me that that's everything that came over in the paperclip group. They had physicists, they had propulsion and engineering specialists, and they had biological science specialists. But definitely, the biowar ambitions and competencies that the U.S. saw in these Nazi scientists was something they coveted, that they were interested in, and that's why they were acquired.
Now, you also mentioned that the infection at Willowbrook was hepatitis B. And
Correct.
I asked you offline when we first conversed about that because, well, as most people are aware, as I have talked about my dad and as I showed in my book, um, at a moment in his career when he was being transferred from a high-level FBI agent to the Pentagon to work on special operations under Kennedy. He was stricken with a severe case of hepatitis, and the only records that I have describe it as, quote, infectious hepatitis, unquote. And I asked a number of people if because subsequently they've been working on a hepatitis B vaccine, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
And so my interest is, would they have, if they, assuming that that they infected him with something, would it have been hepatitis B so that they could then develop, use, monitor him, see how it affected him, or draw his blood, or use him as a guinea pig to develop their supposed hepatitis vaccine, or would that just have been what they called normal hepatitis, the kind that you would get if you ate, from dirty food, like they were
Sure,
saying, like seafood, for instance, that was
sure.
tainted.
Well,
So
and yeah, and I would be speculating purely to try
okay,
and determine, was it A or B? Considering the nature of the severity of the infection and how it impacted him, I'm I'm tempted to think that it's B. It's type B. Generally, type B, when you have a chronic infection or a severe infection, it's much harder on the body and your health than hepatitis A. But that is speculation.
yeah,
As far as weaponizing Hep B, um, as I've stated, this is an iceberg. We can see a certain small percentage of remaining artifacts, evidence, hard data about activities, methods, materials, and objectives of what we at this point will have to say were illegal biowarfare experiments from the era. We only have so much insight. I did not see anything in the materials that I've recovered about Hep B being one of these weaponized germs. But I'll tell you what I did just recently tweet, and that was a great little, cache of individual projects and programs from the 1950s through about the 1990s involving biowarfare, specifically operations that tried to make insects the infectious vector. By that, I'll describe one of them. There was one called Operation Big Itch, and they had fleas feed on a infected animal that had a target pathogen in it, an unusual pathogen. Then they dropped those fleas from elevation to see if they would survive the temperature and atmospheric stresses, and if they would be viable and infectious. And indeed, they were. And they confirmed in the target animals that the fleas were dropped on that the fleas had, in fact, survived and were quite capable of carrying this disease vector. That's one of many, many operations that I see in the literature that have since been declassified. So that isn't a direct bright line to the scenario that your father encountered. If he was exposed intentionally, that would definitely be in keeping with smaller operations that I saw in the literature. And that would be more on the intelligence and defense side. We're not talking about the AMA or the CDC. We're talking about bases and components or operations within these entities who took it upon themselves to test upon small parts of the general public. There were tests where they gassed offshore and then watched how many people in San Francisco, speaking of scene of the crime, had a respiratory infection and went to the hospital. There's been a number of different ways where they will dispel or dispose a pathogen or an agent or an incapacitating agent on an unsuspecting population and then observe. And that's the operation, is to essentially do a small test of deploying a chemical or biological agent on people. So, I'm not sure if anything, as the Wizard of Oz says, I don't know if there's anything in my bag for you, Dorothy. I I haven't seen anything that tonight I could say, we can take A and B and put them together, and this explains more specifically or fills in a piece about what happened to your dad. I'll say that anecdotally, it certainly seems at pace with the kinds of activities that I saw in the material.
Well, thank you. Now you have SV40 up on the screen right there,
Oh,
and that reminds me that I wanted to get your opinion on the work of Ed Haslam and his book Dr. Mary's Monkey. It's the first opening I had to
mhm,
the theory of cancer by infection, and of course that's the other end of my dad's story is that it's my theory has been that the hepatitis weakened his immune system, making him vulnerable to cancer, which he ultimately a kind of quick cancer with metastasis that he died of. Well, so that there is Dr. Mary's Monkey and
mhm,
SB40, and I'm sure you've looked through that.
I
I went
have.
down to Florida. I interviewed Ed Haslam, drove around with him, looked at the scenes where the events of the book occurred,
Mhm.
and I was very impressed with his work. I still am. I think he did a great job in the book, and there's a lot more to be found out that can only be hinted at, as you say. We can't see everything, but I'm sorry. Let me shut up and let you respond to the question.
Not at all. No, it's perfect in line, and I definitely respect Ed's research. You know, being an eyewitness to many of those events and meeting the people that he writes about is huge. I think it's what it in my eyes, what it does is kind of create a perfect little cameo of one of these what I call honeycomb projects. One little cell. There were many other activities and many other universities and scientists and projects and grants, believe me, NIH grants, tied to the similar types of work that was described in Dr. Mary's Monkey. What it helps the reader to understand is the isolation of that little honeycomb, that little cell. You won't read about large conventions where they are all comparing their practices, materials, plans, etc. You won't hear about other project members or other team members joining the team and coming in and out. They generally would keep a scientific cell. Think of like the Manhattan Project. You know, you've got a top secret mission. Your part of it is this little piece of the biology. Focus on that and keep it secret. That's generally, in my opinion, how they would approach these groups and set them up to perform their focus area. And in this case, what we're talking about, for those of you that haven't read the book, and I certainly include Dr. Mary's Monkey on my recommended reading list, in for a number of reasons, but specifically for the fact that it looks like he is really burrowing in with a microscope on one of these little honeycomb projects, and you'll see the conduct, the lack of ethics, the criminality of what occurs in that space, particularly at the end of the research, what happened to Dr. Mary. So I think that SV40 was one of many, many, many pathogens that were on the list for experimentation, hybridization, and combining it with other pathogens to see how that would affect a test animal. And for those of you that haven't read the book yet, it's really a story. I'm not going to give it all away, but it's a story about someone working on SV40 and bringing in a young scientist who really seemed to be the workhorse. She was really, the one that did the day-to-day experiments and maintained the animals, and really carried the lion's share of the research effort. And it ended in tragedy. But it specifically talks about mutating the simian virus with the use of a particle accelerator. Now, that was one of many methods that were used called attenuation. And attenuation means when you take a pathogen, a virus or a retrovirus, and you challenge it, you insult it, you damage it slightly. And why you're doing that is because then once you've attenuated it or challenged it, you then put it in a different kind of environment. You move a cat germ into penguin cells, or you move a primate germ into human cells, and through several serial passages, meaning it's introduced, it's allowed to grow and populate and proliferate, and then it's culled or resampled, re-isolated. That's called serial passage. When they do that again and again, they can shift a cat germ into a person germ. So when you see a lot of things in the literature about human herpes virus X or human endogenous retrovirus Y, you're seeing that human there to distinguish and differentiate between very similar pathogens that exist in other animals. And the origin story of each of those pathogens can, in and of itself, be a research project. So that's, SV40 has its own story, but definitely Dr. Mary's Monkey, very, very good book. Very good insight as to, like I said, some of the conduct and the lack of ethics around these projects. And a lot of the scientists who would pipe up and start expressing concerns about where is this work going or what is this going to be used for, if they had that kind of an ethical standpoint, if they really showed their turpitude, quite frankly, a number of them died early deaths. They would die after a quote brief illness or a fall or a drowning, things like that. And those come right out of the CIA, murder manual from the 1950s. Now, I'm not pointing a finger at the CIA as being the cleanup culprit for all of those, but the CIA has that function. They have people who are there to keep state secrets, and other agencies do it too. So again, it's not all cloak and dagger, but I would say that Dr. Mary's Monkey was an example where you see at the end what can happen to a scientist after they do the good work, and I think it's an excellent referral. So let's keep moving here. So from SV40 and those early discussions in the early 1960s, they decided, hey, this stuff is gold. From a warfare perspective, we're seeing all kinds of these things. They're presenting in different patients who've had a primate-based medical intervention, whether it's a transplant or a transfusion or a vaccine prepared in primate materials. Let's get studying on this stuff. And they did. This is where the story really begins for what most of the world knows as the HIV patent holder, Dr. Robert Gallo. What most folks don't know is that when he stood at the podium in 1983 and was named as the austere scientist, and our own Dr. Robert Gallo has discovered the cause of AIDS, they didn't tell everybody that he'd been looking for primate pathogens that cause cancers and leukemias since the early 60s. So the probability is, not to give the punchline away, that Dr. Gallo, through the course of this work, along with many other scientists and agencies and institutions, I want to emphasize, did indeed find and most likely create HIV. Because of this point, we know that the immediate direct parent, the genetic progenitor to HIV type 1, which is the major form of HIV that affects most people in the world, uh, came from the chimpanzee pan troglodyte. That was the darling of what Dr. Gallo was studying. He was studying macaques and bonobos and chimpanzees. And he was maintaining an entire primate farm, a network across the US, so that they would have a ready supply of animals or of subsequent parts, their blood, their kidneys, their tissue, whatever was needed for the medical application. So I would posit, based on the papers that I have seen spanning from the early 1960s to the quote unquote emergence of AIDS that most people date at 1981, which is actually a couple of years after people really started dying of it. I would say that through his engagement with the Special Virus Cancer Program, working directly with a major biowarfare supplier, Lytton Litton, Litton, and working in a very consistent track from the 60s to the early 80s of the type C RNA tumor virus from primates. That was one of his specific focus areas, which is, by the way, the category for both SIV and HIV. I would propose that Dr. Gallo is closely culpable, along with his cohorts, for the jumping, the migration of HIV from its original hearth in chimpanzees when it was called SIV. We continue through the 1960s and we find that the scientists are getting better and better at isolating, observing, and doing what is called full characterization of a continuing catalog of more and more pathogens out of animals, in particular a focus on the primates. They're also beginning at this point to combine two or three pathogens together to see the effect on animals. I've seen the tables that show them combining with Epstein-Barr virus and Marburg virus and leukemia viruses from birds and rats and other animals, and making these strange cocktails and then observing how quickly the animals got sick and died. So to say that this was a fight against cancer when they were inventing new ways to cause and trigger and infect with cancer, I said that cancer is infectious. That's coming back to one of your earlier points. I cannot let them off the hook and say, oh, they just didn't know what they were doing. Oh, those kids, they were just fiddling around with test tubes and monkeys. No, they had a very, very clear microscopic understanding of what was occurring in their work and where they were going with it. So we get to the mid 1960s and the Special Virus Cancer Program is in full swing. There are dozens of contracts listed in the materials. I have my hands on a number of the original annual progress reports. And that's really probably, there are many smoking guns in this material, but the progress reports are probably the best place to go. If you're watching us on the screen here, and we'll go ahead and share out the link to this timeline as well, there's a link to the 1978 Special Virus Cancer Program Annual Progress Report. It's close to 300 pages, but it discusses how these new capabilities in biowarfare aren't going to be closed down. They won't be shuttered. They're being integrated as ongoing functions and departments at the NIH. And then, of course, I looked into the 1980s. I looked at artifacts from the NIH and I saw their recombinant DNA department and what they were up to. And they were continuing this work. And very soon that work became known as gain of function. So it was categorically biowarfare. I'm scanning through some slides here. We've already talked to a lot of the activities and the details here. Just a note, this is an image of the sooty mangabey. I mentioned HIV type 1 has a natural hearth of the chimpanzee pan-troglodyte. The sooty mangabey is the natural hearth for HIV 2. And if you remember, there were two quite distinct clades or varieties of HIV that emerged at the same time. One of them was on the west coast of Africa in a pretty restricted geological area. The other, HIV type 1, suddenly emerged simultaneously in several populations around the world. Now, let's talk about the naysayers. Let's take a minute and talk here about Peter Duesberg. Dr. Peter Duesberg emerged in the 1980s and claimed that AIDS had never been isolated and that AIDS was caused by toxic gay lifestyle and gay men inhaling poppers. That's where the Kaposi sarcoma had to be coming from, is from gay men using poppers. Well, I would purport that Dr. Duesberg, if he wasn't a managed or a controlled asset, was at least willing to play that chaos agent role. The reason that I say that is that I found papers from his work, for example, in 1974. He was employed under an NIH contract at Berkeley, crossing his own cancer and leukemia causing bird viruses back and forth and making new chimeras, new hybrids that cause cancer quite aggressively that had never existed in nature before he did his experiments. But yet, 14 years later, he pretends that these kinds of pathogens don't exist and that they haven't been isolated. So that's where I know he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. I don't have anything, to level legal or direct accusations at him besides to say, look, the proof is in the pudding. You're you're saying these things don't exist. You're making excuses that don't jibe with all kinds of epidemiologic information. Yet a whole portion of the community that were affected by HIV/AIDS just latched on to Dr. Duesberg because they were in a state of despair and anguish. Everyone was dying around them. And they thought, oh, this is great. We can give up on this safe sex thing. It's just the toxic lifestyle. We should not be partying so much. And they got infected and they died. So I will point a finger at Dr. Duesberg because there's blood on his hands, and his motivation for saying those things for several years, I can only surmise were part of an information management or co-intel operation to help distract people from what was starting to come forward. Because by the late 80s, as he hit the scene, the early whistleblowers, like Dr. Strecker and Dr. Cantwell, were already trying to get press and trying to get this word out. Now, let's talk about what was lost in the 1980s. I just mentioned Dr. Robert Strecker. He and his brother Teddy are the original OG whistleblowers. They came forward with a whole pile of material, and I'm talking about peer review articles from the journals of scientists who'd been employed under the SVCP program and said, we have a problem here. We think that this work is directly related to what the gay community is suffering from with this HIV thing. They made a mailing and sent it out to mayors and governors and members of Congress, members of the Senate, scientific and academic leadership, and they had very few replies. It was met by most with silence. But one person of note was State Senator Huff from Illinois. And Senator Huff said, I believe you. And they had conversations. Well, in August of 1988, Teddy was found shot in his apartment. He had a full life. He had his own company. He and his brother had business plans. He had spoken with his brother the night before. There was nothing wrong. Yet he committed suicide, according to the police report. A month later, State Senator Huff was found dead in his apartment in the Chicago area, one state over. So Teddy was killed in Springfield, and Senator Huff died in Chicago. So that's part of why I maintain my anonymity, is that the early whistleblowers paid the ultimate price for their efforts. And those who published about it and got into print, that would be Dr. Horowitz with the AIDS and Ebola text, and Dr. Cantwell with his shorter publications, seemed to be pretty easily marginalized. They were pushed aside because they were presenting these things which are outlandish claims, outrageous to most people who've never heard about these activities. They're unaware that these things go on. So it wasn't difficult to push them aside and say, oh, tinfoil hat, conspiracy theory. That's all it took in the 90s to basically take the wind out of their sails. But if you do want to go back and look at the real fantastic foundational work, I would say get Dr. Horowitz's text, which is available in PDF. You can have it on your computer immediately, called AIDS and Ebola, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Dr. Leonard Horowitz. And the reason that I recommend his work above all others is the comprehensive timeline that he lays out. And he includes photocopies of a great number of the original artifacts. So you can have your own, you can see for yourself precisely what they were describing, what they were doing, both at a policy level and in the laboratory.
One of your earlier slides, 2 slides back, I think it was captioned how the induction of cancer by viruses. Tell us a little bit about that because in my own case, I had cancer. I had prostate cancer, and I
Mhm.
was treated by uh, what was his specialty? I don't remember, but anyway, he said, you don't get cancer from viruses. You get cancer. You can get cancer from radiation, but not from a virus. That was his opinion. I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. Um, you're saying here cancer can be induced by viruses. What's the background for that?
I'll be very careful and specific here. Uh, I I I would say that many oncologists, dermatologists, proctologists, etc., the specialists who deal with the patient who's coping with one of these conditions, most likely has no background going back to the 50s and 60s to look at this material. So I'm going to let them off the hook and say, ignorance is bliss. But when I put this slide together, it's because in paper after paper after paper, as you'll see in the bibliography, if you want, once you get to the slideshow, please open the bibliography and you'll see horrifying papers you never wanted to know about. But you'll find over and over and with increasing specificity and sophistication, they demonstrated that they could transplant cancer by way of what were called filterable particles or filterable agents,
Hmm.
which eventually we came to classify into all of these specific genetic and morphologic buckets, like type A, type B, type C, RNA tumor viruses, things like that. And the reason that they're called tumor viruses is they are isolated and they express in high concentrations in the presentation of solid tumors or leukemias or sarcomas or whatever the type of neoplasia is, and they've been demonstrated that you can introduce them into a healthy test animal or subject, say for example a human being who received a infected vaccine product and then developed leukemia, from which they isolate primate tumor virus and can then put that in another animal and cause that animal to have cancer. I'm sorry, but your specialist didn't know what the hell he was talking about. There's a whole catalog of pathogens that are involved in human cancer. There is no one single smoking gun. SV40 is one of many that has been shown, and you can order it as a scientist and put it in an animal to demonstrate the presentation of cancer. Now, how people can argue that viruses and retroviruses don't cause cancer is absurd. It's overwhelming. But I'm sorry, but the proof is in the pudding. And I would just say you got to go back and look at the papers, and you'll see them using this language: inducing cancer, inducing neoplasia, causing cellular transformation. That's code for cells that are growing out of control, aka cancer. So you can go back and see for yourself, get your own grip on what cancer is. Now, it's not all black pills. There are a great number of cofactors that appear to participate and help cancer to present. Um, Bacillus licheniformis, BL, is found in high concentrations. It's a bacteria. It's pleomorphic, which means kind of like a polywog, from an egg to a polywog to a frog. It has several different states. It goes through a life cycle. But there are many different pathogens and fungus and cofactors that exist in our bodies and that we can get exposed to that seem to give cancer a leg up. One of them would be anything that downregulates your 53BP1 gene. That's a mouthful. It's a protein. It's a specific gene that's our number one defender against cancer in our own bodies. It's part of the mechanism that recognizes if our cells are growing out of control or beginning to demonstrate cancer signaling and shut that situation down. So if something downregulates your 53BP1 gene, That can be one of those cofactors. It hobbles your body's ability to defend itself. So what I found were tables and tables and tables of combinations of mixing Epstein-Barr with SV40, different variants,
Mm.
etc., and quite effectively inducing cancer as a result.
I've looked at your bibliography, folks. You can see it yourselves. It's very impressive. Obviously, your opinion carries a lot of weight, Nick, and I appreciate your filling me in on that. Let me give you back the floor because I know you have more slides, and we've only got about 8 or 9 minutes left. So take it away.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to get into every nook and cranny of, say, the politics, the power players, like Dr. Henry Kissinger and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb from the CIA, who were key players in scrubbing this story from the history books. What I'm referring to primarily is the destruction of records as directed by then CIA director and his key, they called him the poisoner in chief, Dr. Gottlieb, in 1973, when the decision was made to eliminate as much material, probably original records, unique, to their conduct, covering up MK Naomi, which was a top secret biowarfare compartment that crossed primarily the CIA, but was in several different, defense and intelligence groups, and MK Ultra. They destroyed and shredded a great number of records, an unknown amount, and basically excused themselves from culpability for illegal biowarfare activities. That kind of investigation. There are books, there are videos, there are in fact, a great deal of investigators have gone back to those moments in the 1970s. They might seem like old, boring historical topics at first blush, but in relationship to what we're going on, we're all experiencing today with COVID-19 and the arguments and the evidence that are surfacing about its most probable laboratory origin, the parallels are chilling. They're very difficult. So let's talk about the booster rocket in 1969. They had been fiddling with the germs. They had been practicing inducing cancer, leukemia, sarcomas, lymphomas in a variety of different animals and in people. And I have seen and confirmed in the papers that they had a great number of samples from people who had been exposed to primate pathogens and then presented cancer. They were quite interested in the isolates from those patients because the pathogen had proven that it could already begin an infectious path into human beings just through unmodified exposure, like using the kidney material to make a vaccine. Well, there's no biowarfare involved in that kind of a procedure. But if that pathogen is immediately infectious to people, that means it's quite viable and it crossed the species barrier easily. So that's where they began focusing, and they were quite excited about the great number of germs they had on the shelf. This is the only slide that I'm going to read you. And this is where I state that intent and a clear understanding of what they were doing and where they were going with it was well known from the top down. There is no single dastardly evil scientist. It was quite a broad enterprise. Here's the quote from a scientist in the Army Research and Technology Group promising a new capability to Congress in an appropriations committee in 1969. Quote, within the next 5 to 10 years, it would probably be possible to make a new infective microorganism, which could differ in certain important aspects from any known disease causing organisms. Most important of these is that it might be refractory to the immunological and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious disease. So, this was the kind of capability that was being promised by Dr. MacArthur. The funding failed in 69 and it passed in 1970 and gave the SVCP another $10 million. And in 1978, after a series of hepatitis B vaccine trials that were conducted from the 50s to the 70s, a cohort of 3 groups of gay men volunteered to fight hepatitis B. And starting in November of 1978 in New York, at the Kimball Blood Center, 1,083 gay men rolled up their sleeves and took 3 shots of Heptavax B. According to the eyewitnesses that I have located and interviewed who lived in Manhattan at the time, men who volunteered in the study were quite verbal about it. They were not told to keep it anonymous or to keep it quiet. They told folks that they were taking the shots. And as early as January of 79, so about 60, a little under 60 days past getting their shots, many of the study participants began getting sick and dying. Now, I'm gonna put the bookmark in there so that we can close with some, questions and follow-ups because we're close to the end of our time here. I would encourage everyone to come back and we'll make sure to amplify the URL for this timeline. I would encourage you again to look at the bibliography, and within the bibliography is also a link to the unabridged research library that I maintain out on Zotero. And Zotero is a free open source research tool that lets you organize your papers and share them online. So this is a subset. This reference list here is a subset of the materials that are out here on the unabridged library. For those of you that really go for the peer review papers, this is where the evidence is.
Well, I'm really excited to start reading all of that stuff. I'm going to dig in as you suggest and get into the peer review literature. And there's an awful lot of slides here that we haven't gotten to yet, and I regret that. But thank you for slowing down and taking my questions as they came along. I noticed we have a number of folks in the chat room that are very interested in this topic. And you mentioned Mark Kulak at the beginning of the show, or actually off the line, and he's here with us, Housatonic Live. Let's see, Mark, do you have any questions you'd like to ask since we have this opportunity? And anybody else want to toss a question out before we run out of time? Let's see. Well, it's been a very, very educational and smooth presentation. I do appreciate it. I have not got Horowitz's book, although I've been reading parts of it here and there for a couple of years now. Uh, that business from Dr. MacArthur
Hmm.
in '69 ought to shock everybody. Everybody ought to be aware that they decided that they could make a pathogen that could not be cured by either modern science or the human body's innate abilities to defeat disease. And I guess under the theory that if the Russians could do it, we better learn how to do it ourselves. So they would invent an unconquerable disease just because they were afraid that the Russians would invent an unconquerable disease first. And that's as sick as our world has gotten today. It's an amazing, amazing story. But there's truth. The truth is, as you said, it's dirty. It's disgusting, but it's real, and we absolutely appreciate your efforts to educate and help people face what we have to face if we want to get past it.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share and to contact, folks that are interested in this. It's quite overwhelming, and I would say for those of you, for anyone that's really been affected by HIV/AIDS, either your own health or a loved one, if you get to the point where it's overwhelming, step away from it, close the internet, go do something else because it'll be there for you if and when you're ready to come back and dig into the details. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't leave any stone unturned. There aren't any questions about how did Africans get exposed? How did these gay men get exposed? How did it simultaneously just emerge out of nowhere and suddenly we've got a new disease all over the world? It's all there in the material, and as in so much as it's important for you to study and examine it, I would say keep digging, but also keep an eye on what's happening today and those people who are really sacrificing a lot, like Mark and like Jonathan and Kevin and Johanna, I'm naming some other scientists and academics who are in the fight to bring the lab origin of COVID forward. Just keep in mind that there are a lot of people that are fighting for the truth, and keep yourself grounded. Don't get swept away by suggestions or debates that aren't grounded in fact. And I think it'll help inform you.
All right, and everyone, we will put Nick's contact website information on the show notes after the show. Thank you all very much. Nick, special thanks to you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening and this weekend. All right, goodbye, everybody. I'll see you guys on Monday, and thanks again to Nick.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.